Thank you, Rathika, and all the fellow panelists, and of course, the Manifesto Group for the invitation. And I'm hoping to share some insights on the situation in Panama, the question of Panamanian sovereignty, and how this relates to U.S.-China relations. So, in my time here, I want to divide my talk into three parts. The first is to look at a historical look at the Panama Canal as this symbol of the long and often very violent history of U.S. imperial intervention in Latin America, which, of course, as other speakers have noted, is rooted in this 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine. And the second part I want to look at is the aggressions, of course, of the Trump administration as a continuation of this history, reborn in this moment, which is a context of the US's new Cold War against China. And the third part, I'll just highlight some of the positions of China historically and today, and its alignment with the Panamanian people's struggle for sovereignty and national dignity that spans over 6 decades. So maybe just to begin with, I think that Panama's very existence as an independent nation is very closely tied with the Monroe Doctrine itself. And while Panama did declare independence from Colombia in 1804, it wasn't until a century later, in 1903, that it actually became an independent state. And that only happened because of direct U.S. intervention. And I'll just go into a bit briefly, is that at the time, Panama was caught up in a civil war known as the War of 1,000 Days between Colombian elites and factions within Panama. Initially, the U.S. had intervened to actually help suppress the rebellion. But when Colombia refused to grant the U.S. rights to build the canal, which of course is at the center of attention today, Washington very quickly changed its course and backed the Panamanian side instead. And it was very much part of the U.S. gunboat diplomacy, sending gunboats in literally, that Panama declared its independence with the full military support of U.S. And interestingly, this independence came at a cost, of course. Just 15 days later, a treaty was signed that gave the U.S. exclusive and permanent rights to build, manage, and militarily control the Panama Canal Zone, and really set a precedent, a really model for this U.S. gunboat diplomacy throughout the Americas, and opened up a series of future interventions. And we've seen from Cuba to Nicaragua to Haiti to Mexico and beyond. And so throughout the 20th century, the Panama Canal what not only became an economic lifeline, but also an important symbol of this foreign domination. And of course, with that came popular demands for sovereignty, especially amongst the youth. And this came to a head in January of 1964, when many of the students in Panama tried to raise this sort of national, actually literally a national flag in the canal zone. And what they were met with was extreme repression by U.S. forces, local police, and several students were injured and killed. It was a massacre. And this kind of sparked a wave of a variety of, national protests, amongst other things. And the turning point really came when the General Omar Torrijos overthrew this pro-U.S. oligarchy and began implementing a series of progressive reforms and really positioning this fight for Panamanian sovereignty as a key banner of his administration. And he began basically what became a series of negotiations with the U.S. Carter administration to ensure that the canal would eventually be transferred back to Panamanian control, a process that took 20 years from 1979 to 1999 when it was finally completed. And so I'm just saying all this to understand that the history of the Panama Canal has been a history around U.S. imperialist interests in the region. So it's not surprising when Donald Trump came into his second term, his inauguration speech mentions Panama Canal, and it's the only time that actually China was mentioned in relation to the canal. And he had said that, it was foolishly given away to the Panaman people, and he had, said several times, we've heard many speeches that were so-called taking it back. And so I think, like we heard from the previous speaker around Greenland and other places, it's very much part of this, expansionist ambitions that has characterized this first period of Trump's 2.0, whether it's allies of Greenland, Canada, and aggressions in Mexico and others and beyond. So the Panama Canal is very much part of this. And to kind of put into motion this vision was, of course, Marco Rubio, who in his first international trip as the Secretary of State, he visited Panama and warned very ominously the Panamanian president, Mulino, that immediate changes had to be made to reduce Chinese influence over the canal, or, and I quote, the U.S. would take necessary measures. And and I think what we've seen is that despite, the Panamanian government making, some initial sort of strong stances, actually, but really made a series of concessions after this visit. The first thing we saw was that it ended its participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative. It agreed to share intelligence with the U.S. and a series of other concessions that we're seeing specifically right now on CK Hutchinson, which is a Hong Kong-based company that has been basically running several ports, including two sides of the Panamanian port since 1997. And maybe I'll just mention a little bit because I think it's important and it's interesting the players that are actually involved in the situation. It's actually the infamous BlackRock right now that is currently in the process of trying to buy 43 ports from Hutchinson for $22 billion, including the very, very key ports that's Balboa and Cristobal, which is responsible for almost 40% of the cargo containers passing through the Panama Canal. Of course, both Trump and Rubio were briefed by BlackRock's, billionaire chief executive Larry Fink. We're going to see the results coming out in 2 days. It's been very hot and topic in the news, and we're going to have to see what comes up of that. But one thing we're seeing is that BlackRock is very much pushing into an arena that has been an arena where China has been a big player, which is infrastructure. Last year, it bought the Global Infrastructure Partners and is very much in a collision course in terms of China's interests. So if this deal goes through, it could be very much a leverage for the Trump administration to sort of flip the script, making Latin American and Caribbean countries more active to pursue U.S. private sectors to compete in this very critical and strategic sector, which is, port infrastructure, amongst other kinds of infrastructural projects. And so one of the things I think it's not just about a question of, diplomatic or economic maneuvers or pressures. This is very much coming with a strong military presence. What we have seen is that one of the outcomes of Rubio's visit is that there's been agreement to have U.S. military involvement in the Darien jungle region and a possible airstrip to be installed in that area. In addition to this, we've been hearing quite a lot of rumors or reports around possible U.S. military bases returning to Panama on the pretense of certain humanitarian missions. We're seeing reports about the U.S. military Southern Command considering options, including, and I quote, taking the canal by force. And so I think what we also have to recognize is that many of the progressive and left and popular leaders have actually come together in Panama to really denounce these actions. And they came together with a declaration recently. And the first point, amongst other demands, is outright rejection of foreign intervention and militarization, and a very strong opposition to this U.S. interference and Trump's attempts to retake control of the Panama Canal, its adjacent ports, and establish military bases. And I think that's really important for us to elevate the voices of the Panamanian people that are resisting this kind of aggression. And just to kind of wrap up a little bit, I wanted to talk about, I think, China's relationship, especially the People's Republic of China, with Panama. There's been a long history of solidarity, but interestingly, it's only in 2017 where Panama officially recognized the PRC and cut ties with Taiwan, being amongst the last 20 countries in the world with diplomatic ties with Taiwan. And it was very quickly, shortly thereafter, that Panama joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese companies began to invest heavily in terms of bridges, ports, and other logistical infrastructure. And we've been seeing in the recent years, China has been deepening its ties with Latin America and the Caribbean. It has already replaced the U.S. as South America's top trading partner. While what we're seeing in response, without really an ability to react in a concrete or constructive way to China's increasing influence in the region, what has been the U.S.'s response? More threats of sanctions, annexations, and sometimes even very underwhelming responses. I think one of the things we saw recently was the announcement of the 3.5 billion Chancay port in Peru, built by Chinese companies with Chinese investments, et cetera. very shortly after that was announced or unveiled, what did we see? We had Anthony Blinken announcing a so-called donation of these used passenger trains from California, and it was kind of a, I think a PR failure completely, to kind of compare the kinds of investments and projects that China is really putting in the region. And maybe I'll just end, I think, with something to take us back to this long history of solidarity. And it's something to do in 1964 when I'd mentioned this massacre of Panamanian students in the Canal Zone. At the time, 20 million Chinese people across the country actually protested, 20 million people in support of Panama's sovereignty. And Chairman Mao Zedong issued a formal statement which was published widely across the country. And I'm going to quote him because I think it's still very relevant to our day. And he said, and I quote, "The heroic struggle now being waged by the people of Panama against U.S. aggression and in defense of their national sovereignty is a great and patriotic struggle. The Chinese people stand firmly on the side of the Panamanian people and fully support their just action in opposing the U.S. aggressors and seeking to regain sovereignty over the Panama Canal Zone. U.S. imperialism is the most ferocious enemy of the people of the world." And so I think we can see 61 years later, Panama Canal once again is at the center of this U.S. imperial dominance as a part of this reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine. And I think these words from Mao Zedong might be quite, still resonate and still hold true for us. I just wanted to end with this picture that I had found in the archives of some of the protests and the solidarity messages from the Chinese people, which I think are still true today. Here's another picture of the massive protests that happened in the Tiananmen Square. And some of the slogans of that time, 61 years ago, when they were saying firm support of the struggle of the Panamanian people to recover the canal. They said, "Panama, yes, Yankees, no." And this really filled the streets and the airwaves. I think that today the demands very much resonate as the people of Panama firmly defend their sovereignty in the face of the U.S.'s new wave of aggressions in the region. So thank you very much.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.